Mr. Chairman, if you'd like to call the meeting to order.
Yes, sir. So I'd like to call the Harbor Planning Committee of June 23rd to order, quorum being present. We don't know if we need a quorum, sir, John, but pursuant to section 20 of chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, this meeting will be conducted by remote participation. Additionally, all votes taken by the Harbor Planning Committee during this and future remote meetings will be held by roll call vote. If there is a public comment period, if you are calling in on a phone, you can press *9 to request to speak. If you are watching on a computer or a device, there is a raise hand button that you can tap or press to request to speak. This meeting will be recorded and made available on the city's website in accordance with the state open meeting laws. I don't see anybody that's calling in, so I think we're okay in the telephone number business. And we have, so let's introduce our members just for sake of good order. We have Mr. John McCarthy, Katie Call, Vito Gigloni, Tom Balfe, Tony Gross, Tessa Deering Brown, sorry, Tessa. And we have support staff and the planning director, Greg Catamatori, Gemma Wilkins, and Taskina. And I saw Matthew someplace. There he is, and Matthew Little. So welcome, folks. Thanks for taking time out of our beautiful afternoon here. We do have a posted agenda that people have had an opportunity to review. Greg, if you want to make a comment.
Just continue that. And I think wanted to make sure I wasn't muted. Rookie move. So Matt Littell and Taskina are here. They've prepared a presentation to kind of walk through the agenda. I think it probably will be appropriate with a couple points to break for questions and discussion from the members. And there's I think a fairly natural cadence that goes along with the agenda with the presentation. So if you want to share your screen, Taskina, that could work.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Right. Great. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a Thursday afternoon. So much like last time, our agenda will be focusing on sort of site-specific areas. We'll start with debriefing from our last meeting when we had that session on I4C2. And we'll be doing something similar for 112 Commercial Street as well as the East Gloucester area. And as Greg mentioned, throughout the presentation, we'll pause to have discussion about each of these areas. So if you have any questions while we're presenting, please feel free to raise your hand. But just a quick update before that as to where we are in the process. So we are almost halfway through our sort of timeline. And we are working towards the draft plan recommendations. And part of that will be the site specific recommendations. And we're also working towards public meeting 3, which we are aiming to have towards the end of July. And public meeting 3 will focus on both sort of the larger recommendations for the MHP itself, but also these site specific recommendations that we're going to be discussing today. I will now hand it to Matthew to talk us through our last sort of workshop that we did for I4C2 with you all.
Yeah, we are just big picture. We're on the cusp really of crafting more specific recommendations that are going to go into the plan, and we're beginning to construct how the plan is going to be organized and where the emphasis is going to be. And so we're trying to go through a series of things here that we know we have to address, and getting your feedback and ideas again before we take it out to the general public. We talked about I4C2 last time. We wanted to circle back, confirm what we heard. It's an important parcel, and the way that we characterize it in the plan, what we want from there, what kind of flexibility we might want. I want to make sure that we sort of get that right. If you go to the next slide, Taskina. We all know where it is and what the issues are. you can go to the next slide. We talked last time very quickly about what the requirements are for supporting use to qualify for supporting use, which we see as one possible way of filling out the remainder of the site, but also actually thinking about what kinds of uses could further support the upkeep maintenance of the dockage that's there and the businesses that operate out of it. Next slide. So these were some ideas about possible uses based on our last meeting. I believe that there was still some interest in maintaining some flexibility in the absence of a very crystal clear single proposal that was unanimously approved. These are sort of some of the guiding questions and uses that I think would probably be acceptable for most, including supporting uses like a restaurant or fish retail or wholesale, and then some either marine industrial compliant uses like boat repair or fish processing. Next slide. A summary of the high points of what we think we heard from our last discussion. I think there was universal interest in providing both infrastructural and operational support for the existing fishing operations that are there. That includes bulkhead repair and maybe a more systematic and well-defined and well-organized way for those operations to store their traps at different times of year. I think, as I mentioned before, there's a desire for the plan to remain a little bit flexible because we don't know what might come along, and there isn't something on the table that is inclining us to lean one way or the other yet. Retaining or framing a view to the harbor, which is a actually important part of the complementary nature of tourism and the traditional maritime economy. Not just having the maritime economy, but actually having it be a touristic draw and to maintain that sense of connection between Rogers Street and the working waterfront. An acknowledgement that the FEMA design flood elevation is going to be very, very challenging for any kind of business that actually needs to access the water. And then I think, given that the upland portions of the site are much higher in elevation, they're much further from the water, given the shape of the site is sort of tapers away and up and out from the water, I think there's an acknowledgement that to make another supporting use viable on this site, that we may need up to a 50% supporting use allocation on this site. And I highlight this because it's been made clear to us that even though the way that supporting use allocation has changed from the last plan, that it is within our right to sort of tag the site, state the reasons why we think we might need up to 50% here, and why this might be a good site to do that. It's something that if we are interested in it, we would like to sort of get it into the language of the plan so that it's that language is kind of out there. It doesn't necessarily entitle us to any supporting use we want in the future up to 50%. It's merely to say that if a supporting use comes along that needs 50% of the area, these are the reasons why we think that this might be a good site for that. And then I think there was some discussion about redefining the navigational channel, but I think we understand that to be maybe a much longer term kind of idea, but something to keep in mind. Next slide, Teskina.
Tom has his hand raised.
Okay.
Yeah, let me see. So you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, am I right that in Chelsea Creek, there's a case in the last couple of years where the supporting use was permitted. And in that case, I think it was also up to 50% in advance of a water dependent industrial use. Have I got that right? Are you familiar
Yes.
with that?
Yeah, it's actually more modest than that. It's something like 30 or 35%. It's only on one site, which is a site that's largely out of jurisdiction in the DPA, but out of jurisdiction. It also is sort of coupled with a redefined water dependent use zone to make it more both usable to both the marine industrial and non-marine industrial. And then I think that whole allowance was also sort of sweetened by some sort of fund that would support water dependent uses to which this project would contribute. So there was a kind of offset built in to the arrangement. If you want more detail, Jamie Fay worked on it, but it's pretty much in the Chelsea Creek Municipal Harbor Plan, the DPA plan.
Tony?
Do we want to wait till the end of this piece before we start asking questions? Because I got a few, but.
No, this is the moment for questions. There's a prompt in the next slide.
Okay.
We quickly pulled up
Okay.
how did we let me go through this slide, and then I'm going to open up the floor. In 2014, we sort of dug up, what were the goals for I4C2? It was not front and center in the plan itself. I think there was a reference to a possible idea of a marine research center or ocean development center. And this image was, I think, in the index, if that's correct, Teskina. But we felt it was important for us to just remember where we had positioned it the last time. But I don't think it was as critical as it is now. Okay, next slide is the floor is open to questions and comments.
Tony, the floor is yours.
All right. Can we go back to the timeline? And that we're talking in a month. I guess it's the next page but in a month, we're going to have a draft plan recommendation. We've seen nothing about the rest of the harbor and the capacity for the fishing industry, dockage or industrial base, or what's required for today's use or what's required for future use. That's going to answer an awful lot of questions. And if we don't come out with that in this report, I don't see, we need to have those questions answered. Whether people like the answer or not is a whole nother story, but we just need to have that truth. And I know I brought this up a long time ago, and I'm not seeing it anywhere here. It seems like we're focused on these two parcels right now. And next we're going to be talking final recommendations, and that has me a little concerned. So I don't need an answer right now. I just wanted to, unless you feel like answering, but I doubt you have one. So I just wanted to tell you about that concern that I have.
No, I do have an answer, which is that we're using the time we have to go through things that we haven't talked about yet. A lot of those other things were addressed during the economic analysis, and all of that comes back when we start to draft the plan. We're just using these times now to talk about things that we haven't really explicitly discussed yet. So it isn't that we have sort of left that behind or we won't be addressing it in the plan. A lot of that research was done during the economic analysis and the infrastructural analysis. And, we will bring that back up when we begin to formulate the overall framework.
Well, I must have missed something then. So, because I didn't see any of what I was, thought that we would have that, that we hired you guys for. We know all the anecdotal information. That's not what we were looking for. Okay, next is on I think it's the page 7, the trap storage is also traps over on the upland too. You only have it on the boardwalk.
Yes, yes.
Okay, just wanted to. And then can parking be used as a supporting use for economic reasons? Because, they have a Star Market in wherever it was, Chelsea Creek or
Yeah.
Fall River. Is that a supporting use that can be used?
I think so. I don't know what the appetite would be to give a license for that permanently. I think when it comes to licensing, they'd be more inclined to give that kind of license on a temporary basis, which is for 10 years. But it's a very good question. I think, as long as there was a clear financial benefit, yeah. But then if it's technically a supporting use, then it's only 25% of the site. And so I don't know how much parking that would be.
Got it. And I may have missed it here, but I'm not seeing anywhere where you're talking about the constraints of I4C2 because of the waterfront is taken up by a already entrenched use. So I don't know, I think that needs to be addressed, how that impacts particularly, almost any fish processing. It would have a huge impact on that. Boat repair, there's no launch area. So
Right.
I was just wondering if there's anywhere we're going to see any of what those constraints do to future development here. If we're, because we're talking about future development, we need to know what we're up against, and to not address that, I think, would leave us a little bit of a handicap.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that even for marine industrial uses, there may be conflicts with the existing uses.
Yeah.
And I think this is the moment to articulate that, right? That I think there's pretty much general support for those current uses. I think there's 13 leases, right? Mostly lobster operations. I think the site seems to be doing a good job providing much needed dockage for the smaller fishermen. I think it's something worthwhile to bring up in the plan that there's a preference for uses that won't disrupt the existing ones, right?
Right. Yeah. So I think that if
Yep.
there's something that could go in there about that, I think that would be really helpful for future planning. And I did look at all the old listening posts or the projects that were out of the listening posts. I forget how many there were, 16 or I forget. But I did look at them all.
I think there were about 20 or so. Yeah.
Was there? I looked at every one of them. What I saw was the major holdback on all of them is they didn't have any capital investors. So I think that's something we need to make very clear, is that the city's not in the business of bankrolling anybody who goes down there. So I think, as people come up with ideas again, I think that we need to make that clear that this requires private investment, not that can try to tap into public funds through Seaport Economic Council, but that's, in tandem, but they have to have their own, skin in the game as far as money goes. So I don't know if that's, that's something that I saw when I was looking at all that, was basically I didn't see any investors that were looking at, particularly long-term, they have to have, even if the city helped them get it built, there still has to be a long-term, capital or maintenance investment by whoever the private entity is that's going to be running it. So.
Tony, you touched on an important point that that those 16 or 18 or 20 plans that came about were, funded by the administration. They were basically an idea generation effort, not a project-driven, shovel-ready, investors lined up, we're going to spend money kind of a thing. So more of a, an idea generation versus a, hard applicant kind of a thing. But for what it's worth. The other thing that I wanted to sort of touch in at this point, Matt, is that on I-4C, there's actually 3 separate parcels. Is that correct? 2 or 3?
I think it's all under city.
Yeah, I believe it wasn't 2 at one point.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that may, and I don't know why I remember this, but I think that to Tony's point about protecting the existing use of the leases, I think that the water's edge, for the lack of a better term, is a parcel, and the upland is a separate parcel, even though it's been talked about as one large parcel altogether. And so I'd have to go and check my notes on why I believe that. But I think to Tony's point, that would more crystallize, the protection of that, the water's edge versus, and I think again, the idea of, approaching a 50% accessory use allowance would further that discussion as well. So, Tony, you had your hand raised.
Oh, did I leave it up? Oh, well, I was
I'm
going
sorry. The other, sorry, Vito. Thank you.
always
Vito,
have
the floor
to
is
be
yours.
station.
Thank you, Rick. Matt, could you go back a few more slides there, the one previous to where it talked about the limitations of supporting uses? Yep. This one. So I'm just thinking, sort of to Tony's point, where we're trying to make some headway on the whole plan as well, and using these as an example, like how can you make these work with the existing DPA? We've got a massive site here, and we can already see we're bumping up against water dependent use zones and, where parking can go, and they don't even have any pile supported areas on it. So I'm all for trying to figure out how to make something work with this, but more importantly, figure out where, like that first statement at the top, where is there flexibility that this committee could utilize, and in the rules where you can have a master plan, modify dimensional requirements, so that we use this parcel, but also think about globally how we can make a recommendation in the plan that could apply to the other properties. That's sort of where I would want to focus here. If we can solve it for I-4C2, I'd like to be able to solve it across the board. So where are there flexibilities there? That's saying the department shall waive the numerical standard for supporting DPA uses as defined in that CMR. Just curious where there might be places where we can, change things through the harbor plan.
Well, I think that the, one thing that we might think about is extending this desire to allow more than 25% supporting use to the rest of Harbor Cove. It's less pressing in the much larger parcels up to the north, but because the Harbor Cove parcels are typically narrow and deep, and access is difficult, I think we can explore whether it would be meaningful to bring that as a general issue up. I think it's something that gets decided. We can't just tag it as we're going to get a 50% in this area, but I think if we articulate what the criteria are, right, for how we would assess why this makes sense in this area and how it would contribute overall to the marine dependent activity, I think that might be helpful for us. Ultimately, it gets decided at licensing, right, on a case-by-case basis. But I think having some language more broadly in the plan can pave the way.
And that's sort of what I get from that first, the leading paragraph at the top, is that if there's something in the harbor plan that describes what we're trying to achieve generally, then that will help the department in making decisions on a licensing. You know, if
Yes.
we're silent on it and we don't talk about it, then they've got to go to the letter. So I just love to have a list of those things where we think we can improve things across the board in the harbor, so that we can start to work on those as well. Using this opportunity on these two properties to identify those. I mean, 112 is not even in the DPA. I realize the harbor plan encompasses inside and outside the DPA, but it's the DPA that's a big hindrance. Well, not hindrance. It's an additional obstacle that you need to figure out how to comply with.
Yep.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
I guess just to build on something that Matt had mentioned, just in terms of what we heard, I mean, is there anywhere in anyone's thinking or thought process that there could be a different configuration of the float system, a different shoreline configuration that provides water access for additional uses on the site? I mean, we talk about these 13 boats, and, you know, again, right now, city owns both parcels. If they're unified, you know, that's a different calculus than if you were to consider them separately. As Rick pointed out, there were easements across the parcel that was not owned by the city for access and to the dockage. But I think that's also one of the things, you know, we're not dwelling on, but the RFP that went out, I think, was probably an impossibility to respond to, because there was no commitment as to whether any proposed use would have water access. So I'm just wondering, you know, if there's any thought around, you know, if there was a use scenario that, you know, was providing new uses on the site, water access that were in some ways limiting the number of slips, or maybe it's something that's done in concert with the removal of the project area that reconfigures and maintains 13 slips, if that's something that, you know, people think would be a reasonable approach.
Tony?
Yeah, I don't know if you looked at some of those plans, they had, you know, boats, but they were all encroaching on other people's water sheets where they expanded. I you know, my opinion is you're pretty limited there. You know, you do have the Harbor Commissioner's line, which doesn't allow you to go out a whole lot further. And, you know, it's not a big space. There's just not, you know, there's just not a lot of room. And, you know, if you're trying to put in something else that's going to be able to work, it needs space. So that's just, I don't know what Vito thinks, or John, who's been around the harbor, or Tess. But I think it would be difficult. And I noticed on those other plans that they were all encroaching on either the building center or the Gloucester House. So, you know, when they had, you know, whale watch boats and things like that, they were in other people's water sheets. So, you know, some of those weren't quite possible to do, you know, that we're making more space, but we didn't own it. So that's just my 2 cents.
Vito?
Yeah, I think Greg brings up a good point to think about. I believe maybe Matt could weigh in on this. Can't multiple parcels commonly owned stay as independent parcels, but be licensed as under one license, so that, you know, those dimensional requirements of 50-50 or 75-25 can apply globally to the whole combination of parcels without eliminating the interior lot lines? I'm pretty sure you can have a license that encompasses multiple properties. There's a lot of our properties
Yes.
on the waterfront are, you know, they're what do they call it? The certified land court registered parcels, they usually don't make those interior lines go away, but they're invisible under the licensing.
Yeah, there's language in the regs that makes reference often to project area and not parcel area. So I think that's a conservative assumption.
Right. So I think the discussion that Vito's starting is that, not limited to I4C2 or 112, but, more of a larger area.
Oh, okay.
And and not too different from a boundary review that we went through, 10 years ago or however long, 8 years ago. And, this notion of a harbor cove, kind of, lack of a better term, overlay district, starts to get you to think about, more of a legislative kind of approach to the designated port and its restrictions, and having, instead of trying to figure out, winners and losers and applications and projects. Tomorrow, if you wanted to do something, there's standards and there's yeses and there's nos. I think we're getting caught in the weeds and need to sort of elevate ourselves to, having language within this plan that would suggest or reference, future potential uses that would require legislative action, and then comply with the local condition on the ground, given, I4C2 to the Fort or whatever that thing is. So there's multiple people that would benefit in their own way, but have it, less defined, but at least recommended, as Matt talked about earlier, sort of baking it into the plan that it's there for interpretation if somebody wants to pursue it, and not just. And again, my whole frustration is that we haven't. Again, we're not the project managers. We're not the funding agent. We're not the investor. We're not the. So what we're trying to do, in my opinion, is to, set up a framework for somebody to apply to use 112 I4C2, Vito's properties, Lenny's properties, the harbor plan, the harbor line, right, and the building center. Everybody's got their own interests, but we're all stuck in this DPA thing, right? So I don't know that we necessarily need to change, taking another parcel out of the DPA, but at least offer a path to a legislative solution to those concerns, right? Meaning it's almost a use table within the DPA that's needs to be pursued by an applicant, and identify the goals, the benefits, and then let the chips fall where they may, right? Nobody's lining up to spend any money right now, any place. And we're trying to figure out how to put words on a piece of paper to say, yes, come and spend your money, for the lack of a better term. So I think we need to sort of, elevate ourselves into thinking of, we've been at this for years and years, and, again, the things that have happened, GMGI, terrific, right? That's one thing, right? But that's not the solution to the capacity problems that we have. So, Katie?
Yeah, following on that and what others have said, one of the first things that Tony said today was, what he didn't say it in these words, but paraphrasing, what does the data say is possible? And, folks, preferences for one thing or another aren't necessarily the issue, but what do jobs projections look like? What does economic development projections look like? And, Matt responded with, well, we've looked at that. It seems like this group needs to be reminded of some of those take-home messages, because it feels like everybody's kind of come to the same place at this meeting today. I agree with a lot of what folks have said this morning already, but what does the data say is possible? What does the real potential look like for our port? There have been a couple of port studies done. There have been, there's been some information, there's jobs projections out there, whether it's related to fishing or marine science and technology or wind or small business, tourists, whatever it is. What do those jobs projections look like? Or what does the data look like? And then that is going to help this group. I feel like it's going to inform in a statistical way a vision for what could be, as folks were saying, you know, Vito was like, maybe not just for I4C2, maybe not just 112, but you know, what is the potential? How do we make sure that we provide the potential for a shared vision over the next few years? And then that positions us to be able to take some action on the other end of this thing. When we got on this committee, one of the complaints that I heard, or one of the frustrations that I heard from people was, well, we did this 5 years ago and GMGI has come and that's fantastic. But as was just pointed out, that's one thing. So what might be, you know, whether it's actions on these two parcels or collective action around the future of this harbor, how do we set ourselves up for private investment, for folks who might want to come to town to line up to bring their money, but we have to have the business case for that. And I know that all of that is not what the charge of this group is, but that's what I've been thinking about over the last few days leading up to this.
And if I may, just to finish the thought, sort of an example of a legislative act would be, you know, the movement of that harbor line, right? I mean, so, you know, in talking to people that have already thought about that, it's, you know, it's literally an act of Congress, basically. And so you need to have, you know, state and federal legislators get involved and say, this is important to us, right? And, you know, that one thing could benefit 2 or 3 parcels, you know, in that sort of Harbor Cove area. And that's the, you know, the example that I'm sort of leaning on from, you know, this notion of a legislative approach, or at least referring to an approach that may make, you know, people get off the mark a little bit, and spark the opportunity for somebody to say, well, if that happened, then we can do this, and I'd be willing to do that. And all of a sudden, you know, you might create a little bit of gravity with that. And again, with the idea of, you know, access to the water, increasing boat, you know, dockage, you know, even if you broke up I4C2 with the idea of saying, you know, if you touch the parcel, you can't do anything with the water sheet, right? Make that a restriction. So again, my whole thing is that I hope that the recommendations that come out of this plan have a much broader and a much more lenient starting point, as opposed to being more restrictive and, you know, not fostering ideas and different approaches. Because once you get to the local marine industrial, water dependent, DPA, there's plenty of regulation and oversight, and we need to, you know, cast a broader net to say, you know, bring different ideas, please, right? I mean, you know, we're willing to talk about it, and there's plenty of oversight to make sure that it's done correctly. John or Tessa, you haven't heard from you guys.
We're here, Rick. I think I'd like to just get Vito's, I mean, as someone that owns a wharf in that area.
Yeah.
How important the increase in auxiliary use would be to, like, the whole Harbor Cove business, as far as you're maintaining your water dependent business, but the ability, and I mean, you brought this up, you know, the ability to pay your bills by having an auxiliary use. And is that something we want to look at, as Rick just mentioned, as far as, you know, get the ball rolling on finding a congressman that'll attach that moving of the harbor line and taking that federal maintenance permit off the books? Is that something we want to look at in this plan? You know, for the whole Harbor Cove, and how important is that to people that own businesses there, Vito?
Thanks, John. I think it would be important, but the water dependent use zones, I think, sort of pinch these narrow properties anyway, and then the limitation to not be able to put any supporting use over pile supported shrinks it even more. So it's really those dimensional requirements that are fungible, that can be moved at all, or, you know, through a harbor plan I think would be helpful. We thought from the 2014 harbor plan that 50% was the upper limit that you could apply for in a license already. In other words, we haven't been thinking in Harbor Cove about 25%. We've been thinking we could get up to 50 because the measurement is as the whole DPA, and because of the Coast Guard Station, the State Fish Pier, I think those two parcels were the ones that allowed us to get up to 50% on all of the properties that remain. I don't know, Matt, is that correct? Even though 25 is the limitation they look for, our harbor plan talks about, as long as those two properties stay the way they are, you can get up to 50% in a license.
That's how it was framed in the last harbor plan, but CZM and DEP have changing the way that they're talking about this, which is to say, we can't sort of arbitrarily take away supporting use from one area and reassign it to another area, but we are allowed to, let's say, request or make room for more than 25% on a particular parcel or parcels or particular project, subject to the criteria that's in that previous slide. So that allowance is still there, and I want to bring some of that language back into this plan, so that we are sort of bookmarking this idea that these are difficult parcels that may need some assistance with supporting use. Ultimately, again, that gets decided at a licensing level on a case-by-case basis. But I do want to go ahead.
Sorry, Matt, that really important information that we're talking about right now, because what I don't want to participate in is looking at I4C2 and say 112 isn't an issue. I4C2 and as the one property that this committee could be going forward and saying, okay, we're giving up on the 2014 language that everybody thought we actually made headway on, right? And now we're going to come up with a single property or two that could apply up to 50%. I hope that's not, if it's a parcel by parcel that we're going to recommend going forward, that's a whole different charge for this committee than I thought we would.
Yeah, I think our discussion with CZM was more about, again, there was no mechanism to ensure that you don't upset the apple cart, but that they also were pointing out that there's nothing that's prohibiting you from making the case for greater than 25% on an individual parcel, and that they would be looking for kind of some belt and suspenders like we did the last time with having language in the MI in particular that talks about what are the aspects of a project that will, again, not displace, will enhance, kind of very typical language of making the case for when it's reasonable to exceed that 25%. I think we're spending a lot of time talking about these two particular properties because they're publicly owned. We have a lot more influence on what can happen in the next 5 years on these properties than any private property. But then again, there'll probably be things happening on private properties before the public properties. Here we are, second or third harbor plan, looking at these potential options, and it's challenging. And I think, just to reiterate, one of the things, if you're talking about supporting uses being added to, to 65 Roger Street, for instance, and going through the mental math of how much of that site is being allocated to the commercial dockage, to storage, to support, and the access, that's one discussion. The RFP that went out didn't necessarily contemplate just a supporting use. And one of the outstanding questions was, well, how can I be a water dependent use if I'm not allowed any access to the harbor? So again, whether it's a slip or two or reconfiguration and providing, an actual place to really use a derrick and move things across the wharf. Those were things that were not really fleshed out. And that's probably why we didn't get any response. I mean, there were a whole bunch of other things that an applicant was, or a respondent was asked to do that also, again, just didn't make sense in reality at the end of the day. So just to your point, Vito, I think we're talking about in the supporting use as it relates to, this potential site, but it's the case that will have to be made for any property, because CZM has been saying they're not going to kind of support, the kind of abacus that we had going in the last plan, where, we could continue to allow up to 50% because of some of those uses being held as kind of, for all intents and purposes, permanently 100% water dependent.
Any other comments?
There's also just quick follow on that, and then we should probably move on to the next item. But there is an amplification in the last plan, the 2014 plan, that says that that places restrictions on any development or activity that displaces currently docked waterborne vessels. And so, in other words, you can't just displace someone without providing some other place for them to go. So that's another factor that would play into this question that Greg is bringing up, which is how do you invite water dependent uses but no water access? Right?
Well, I think that's, the confounding point, right? And so we've always been water facing. And so if you look at the problem from a different perspective, relative to I-4C2, what project could fit on that parcel that would fit an accessory use that's not water dependent? What box could you place there? Is it another building center? Is it a shopping center? Is it a dance studio? And, that are non-traditional water dependent uses, since you can't displace the current water dependent uses. So if from a different perspective, what tenant would want to be there that didn't really care about the water access, would like to look at the water, but don't care about the access, and could amplify the use through investment and all the other things that we've been talking about. And so I think instead of trying to figure out, I can't displace and I can't provide, alternatives, let's look at the uplands and saying who wants to be here, right? Is it, and that's the $1 million question. Right. So if we want to move on, Matt, that we can.
Yep. 112 commercial. I forget where that photo came from. It was something maybe Greg sent us. This is 112 commercial back in the day as an active facility. A great photo. We want to do a little bit like what we did with I-4C2, which is to do a quick review of what's there, what's possible dimensionally, and what are the sort of key regulatory aspects that might be challenging. You guys are all probably pretty familiar. It's vacant pretty much. Greg, I think I recall you saying that there was some environmental work done on the site.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So there was a underground tank that was tested and then I think crushed and filled.
So it's not in great repair, but there it is, and it is an incredible piece of waterfront if you're just sort of viewing the harbor. Next slide shows a little bit what we're up against. Our reading is that because the site is now owned by the city, that it is classified as Commonwealth tidelands, which comes with higher requirements for public access and public use. As Greg mentioned, we're not in the DPA in this particular parcel, but there is a broad question about whether it might want to support some of the other DPA uses around it. What you're seeing in the dashed line, the dashed red hatch area is the water dependent use zone for this particular site, more or less. It's about 25 feet back all the way around. As a Commonwealth Tidelands parcel, there would be some form of public access to the waterfront required. Typically, it's a 10-foot minimum public accessible harbor walk that would have to be accessed from both sides. And then in addition, within 100 feet of the water, ground floor uses need to contain what are called facilities of public accommodation. So public facilities like restaurants, things that are publicly accessible, but not private. And it's pretty much, because the parcel isn't very deep, it's all but a small corner. And so there are a lot of, if you go to the next slide, actually, this explains a little bit. For a non-water dependent use, we would be required to have 50% open space. There would be a height limitation, I think around 55 feet. There would be facilities of public accommodation within 100 feet of the shoreline, which is almost the entire parcel. So if you go back, Taskina, and if you add parking to support any use on the site, there's not much really left. So half the site is about 10,000 square feet. In other words, 50% of the site would have to be open. The remainder could be building. Of that 10,000 square foot open space, I believe only half of that is allowed to be parking. So there's a lot of restrictions that come with the site. So I want to put out very broadly, if you go to the next slide, next one. I think there's maybe been some fairly loose discussion about what an ideal use might be, but one idea is that it's an open area that supports fishing industry operations, right? Trap storage, staging, that sort of thing. Is it a public open space? A destination, waterfront kind of destination. Is it a private development, right? That would come with a public component like the Harbor Walk, and is a private development financially feasible on a site that small? And then another idea, again, not mutually exclusive, but is there a need for public district parking, right? Is this something that could support some of the businesses that are down there and or some of the needs associated with tourism? If you go to the next slide, Taskina. So these are some thoughts to provoke a little discussion. I certainly open it up for ideas and other insights. Tony's got a hand.
Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, Matt, just for clarification, because so I4C2 does not have those same restrictions as far as the Commonwealth Tidelands because it's in the DPA, or
Exactly.
All right, thank you.
I think Tom's got his hand raised.
Thanks, Greg. So two questions. So one is if there was private development, they are still subject to the public accommodation requirements?
Yes.
Okay. So they're still sort of constrained in terms of, or from their perspective, maybe on public access. The other question is I recently looked at, I think it's adjacent to, but maybe not quite in a high velocity zone, a VE zone. Does that impact from a regulatory standpoint, either the licensing, or it's just a risk factor that any development would have developer would have to consider?
I think it's just a risk factor that will determine, a design flood elevation, obviously. But I will, that's a very good point. We should look that up quickly. It is
I
in a
think
high
it's-
velocity
I think
zone.
it's I think it's elevation 16.
Okay,
So it's pretty impactful. You'd be looking at mostly, mostly parking at grade level, with a higher elevation for habitable space.
John?
Yes, I'm just wondering if anything's been done to identify from a city perspective on, it appears to me, I know we came across this property under a tax foreclosure, I believe. The only thing that I've seen done is some float stored on there from time to time. But I mean, is this something that we've checked with Harbor Master, DPW? It just seems like the city doesn't own another piece of property like this, where it has deep water. I mean, a crane can come in, a barge can come in there and offload, unload. Is this something that the city has really looked at as far as potential uses from a city use and possibly leasing it out that way for a construction company on temporary basis, that type of thing? Because it just seems to me that we don't have another piece of property that the city owns that kind of has this availability to those uses. So I just wonder if that's been considered at all by anybody in the administration or DPW, Harbor Master, so on.
I can tell you that it was one of the sites that was used in the screening for identifying whether there was going to either be investment in the current harbor master's office or whether or not there was the potential for that to be relocated. Because as you know, we were in a long-term lease with National Grid at that site. So it was a little bit of looking at the alternatives. Would it make sense for the city to have the harbor master's facility, on a site owned by the city? And clearly, the end game was it made more sense to make the investment there, and we had the long-term lease allowed for some public funds to be used to invest in that site. It has been used as a staging area from time to time. It's not that secure of a site right now. There's definitely some voids on the property, so it's been used for light storage of floats and that type of thing. So I think even if it were to be used, there'd be a fair amount of investment that would have to go into it to make sure that there's safe access from the water. The seawall is the condition of the seawall, it needs to be examined. But I think part of that discussion is here are there things that potentially could support the existing industries, or I think it's a good point to bring that up in terms of whether or not there's again, we don't own a lot of waterfront, so if there's a city use for it as well.
Tony? You still got your hand up. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So again, I think this is even a more confounding parcel, right? I mean, it's too small to have anything, important done with it. There's all sorts of different regulations. And, what's the best and highest use? And again, it seems as though every time we turn around, there's a requirement that makes it virtually unusable, right? And, so we got a fishing guy, we got a lobster guy, we've got, environmentalist, we got, everybody here that would clamor. I mean, I know Jeff Romero tried to, buy the parcel for $70,000, right? I mean, from the city, and they said no. And, given the, blue sky, right? I mean, I think that we got to, have a little bit of a cloud and head in the clouds kind of attitude at this point to these types of things that, again, if there's so many regulations on, two things that are doing nothing for the city, then something needs to change, in my opinion, right? And that's sort of this concept of a legislative, direction. So, I mean, there's every time you turn around, somebody else is telling you no. And so if we want to do anything, we need to change those rules. I mean, Vito talked about, pile, second story over pile supported, docks. Well, who says we can't do that, right? I mean, And if the answer is no, or it's, well, that's just the way it's been, then let's have that discussion. Same thing with the harbor, line. You can't move that. Well, yes, you can, right? It just takes a little bit, it's a longer discussion. So if the frustrations that come out of this harbor plan, that we can't do anything with the current set of conditions, regulations, oversight, we need relief from that to move the needle a little bit, right? I mean, one thing in 10 years is not, it doesn't, like, Tony said right from the beginning, we're just going to put another plan, on the shelf and then do this 5 years from now, right? So if nothing else, my hope is that, we do a little bit of daydreaming and think about what may be able to happen, and then figure out top down how to get there, right? I mean, the very simplest use for that space would be, trap storage, in my opinion. Make sure it's safe, and displace that maybe potentially from I-4C2, and make that a permanent thing versus a handshake thing, again, as an example. But Katie?
For the residential area behind it in the fort, I realize I think there's a big wall behind that property, right? A big rock wall. But from a storm damage standpoint, I mean, is there anything are those properties back there at risk at all with storm damage or flooding that needs to be a consideration of this parcel, or?
I think they're exposed, but I think they're elevated significantly above this one. And I'm just can't confirm that right here, but that's my
Skinny little road
visual
with
memory.
a big wall, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so the difference, and I wanted to just correct, the flood elevation for 112 is elevation 14. The base or the elevation of Fort Square is up at around 20. So the ground elevation there is around 9 or 10. So there's about a 10-foot wall, and that neighborhood is kind of above.
Okay, thanks.
Tessa?
I just had a couple things. I was thinking, so just from like a bottom line standpoint or whatever, compared to IC42, that this property, the city got during a tax foreclosure or whatever it was. So the city hasn't really put any money into this property, where it seems like IC42 is sort of in the red on a paper point of view, where this property might not be. And just from an idea that, to me, it might make sense for the city either to like maybe figure out how much I would think it would cost, probably a decent amount of money to fix this property. The city might not want to put that much money into something like this that's not going to have any real rate of return with storing traps on it. From my point of view, what are you going to make off of it? Where maybe it would make more sense to keep the public access way and maybe use it for traps, or maybe sell it or go into like a long-term lease with like a group of lobstermen or a group of people that would probably invest their own money into fixing it if they knew they had space that wasn't going to be taken away from them for the rest of the time they were fishing, that they might put some of their own money into fixing it instead of public money. That's just a thought I had.
Makes sense.
I should mention that those public access standards apply to situations where you have non-water dependent use. They're non-water dependent use standards, and that when you do have a water dependent use there, like trap storage or staging, that a different set of rules apply.
Okay, that's good to know too.
Yeah, I should clarify that.
Both Katie and I have had sort of different conversations with different people associated with Salem and the extraordinary amount of money coming into that city associated with offshore wind and mostly in the Gulf of Maine. And certainly the perception is that one of the areas that Gloucester has advantage or strength in is Rose's and the Gloucester Marine Railways in terms of boat repair and that kind of stuff. I don't know whether this, there's not a lot of opportunity for expansion for those two enterprises. I don't know if seems to me it may make sense to reach out to those enterprises to understand whether this parcel could in the future have any value and as some sort of staging area or docking area to assist us, Gloucester and Roses and the ship and the railway specifically, be in a better capacity position to service those vessels. So not an area of expertise for me, but I wonder whether it's worth at least exploring a little bit to understand whether that might have some value to those guys.
Any other comments? If not, we can move on to the next.
The last piece that we want to touch on, again, this is along the lines of we're going to need to address this in the plan, is the East Gloucester former DPA area zoning. At a high level, as you know, the portion of East Gloucester was removed from the DPA, but the zoning for that area was still remains as marine industrial, which has resulted in, you know, I think predominantly it's conforming uses, but there are a few legacy residential uses or other things that are non-conforming. And so it's raised a question of, okay, we're coming up now on the second round. Is this a time to think about the zoning or what we think the zoning should be doing for us? Next slide. As I mentioned, it's marine industrial district zoning, which allows marine related storage, bulk storage, contracted yards, things of this nature. Next slide. We thought it might be more useful to zoom in and see what's actually there on the ground. It's not an unlimited number of parcels, but the real marine uses are certainly predominating, and what you're seeing in the yellow there are some sort of fragments of residential uses that I believe were grandfathered. I'm going to be relying heavily on Greg here to correct me if I'm wrong. And I think even some of the recreational marinas were grandfathered from prior to the establishment of the DPA in the first place. Next slide. And then in the southern area, I think it's the same condition really, where it's predominantly boat access marinas, things of that nature, with a few miscellaneous residential uses. I might hand this section to Greg. There was some discussions and investigations of what a revised zoning could do from 2017. Greg, can I ask you
Sure.
to flesh this part out, because you were there in person?
Yep. I think you can kind of tell from the existing conditions, there's no clear pattern here. We have, some residential inclusions, and then some of the larger parcels. And again, many of them are, they technically fit the bill of marine industrial. They might not fit the bill of designated port area, and they're no longer within the designated port area. So working with Urban Harbors Institute, they provided a fair amount of analysis, and didn't really come up with necessarily a good scenario. A lot of the residential properties are, well smaller than our R5 district that we have right now, with a minimum requirement of 5,000 square feet, 50 feet of frontage. And so, any kind of change or investment in these properties has involved the Zoning Board of Appeals over the years. There haven't been, a number of applications, but they have come forward from time to time. So the final analysis or idea was the potential for a neighborhood business district that could encompass some of the smaller lots. And then, coming up with a newly defined district for the properties that, are larger, have a little bit of capacity. But the theme was, kind of maintaining that it wasn't going to be a new residential district, that they would be those essentially marine related uses that wouldn't be, have to comply with the dimensional requirements of the designated port area. After that was presented to, this was work done with the planning board, and after that was presented, it wasn't particularly compelling. And there were still, again, some questions about, the advantage that this would potentially create or not create for either the residential side or the larger predominantly marina uses. And it just kind of stalled from that point. Jack Wigan also retired. I would note also, since that time, there also has not been a property owner that's come forward with an idea of an alternate scenario to the zoning that exists. And as we know, there's been some investment of uses that would comply with the designated port area in this area. So I don't think it's necessarily a use mix. That's an issue for some of the larger parcels. They've been traditionally water dependent, and there's been investment in some of those sites. So a future scenario might again try to potentially rectify the residential use in the marine industrial district, or again providing some sort of path or allowance. But I think at the same time, some of the feedback was I don't think people were looking for sites to be assembled and taking down some of the kind of traditional character of the residential use that's kind of in the mix for wholesale redevelopment from the ground up.
Tony?
Yeah, Greg, did I understand you to say that this had all been looked at, this had all been looked at before and just didn't seem to be worth the trouble? Is that what I heard you say?
Well, I mean, there's really not a good category to put these very, very small
No,
parcels.
my question is, was this all looked at before? This, what we're looking at now, was that all looked at before?
Yeah, it
Okay.
was.
And that, okay, now you can continue, sorry.
Yeah, so again, it's a challenge to kind of come up with something that would really, we always base things on minimums in terms of minimum size requirements and then use requirements. And, it's just a lot of nonconformity. And if you moved it over into, one of our residential district categories, they're going to be lining up at the zoning board regardless because of the size of the structures and the size of the lots. It would, again, have somebody going in, particularly the residential use with they're allowed because currently they're a non-conforming use and a non-conforming structure on a non-conforming lot. So there could be a benefit to it, but the permitting path doesn't change, and it seemed to have worked over time. The zoning board's aware of the situation of these properties and has reviewed them on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks.
I
Matt, so
might
I know
also
that-
just, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I know that you started this discussion today about, we've got to do something. And I don't know if there's a regulatory obligation that we're responsible for taking. I understand that, we recommended a boundary review. It came out. We made, we went, as Greg described, went through a consultant, determined that, chances of doing much of anything is very, unlikely. And I don't know that that works against us as we make recommendations in the future on the working waterfront relative to DPA saying, well, we took this East Gloucester parcel out and you guys did nothing with it. Why should we do something else? I mean, is that a thing? Is that a response to a blue sky idea in different parts of the DPA, or what's the obligation of East Gloucester relative to the much bigger picture?
It's more of a we want to make sure that we're addressing all areas of the planning area at a
Right.
fundamental level. And this is a significant one, given that it was taken out of the DPA. We've had 8 years to see what happens on its own, even without the help of zoning changes. And so we just wanted to put it back to the, with the wisdom and hindsight that we've gained over the last 8 years to see what's possible here, even without zoning changes. We want to really be a little bit more explicit and have people have a chance to weigh in on what, and even beyond just land use regulation, what are bigger long-term objectives in East Gloucester relative to the overall harbor? Is it more of the same kind of objectives that apply to the rest of the harbor, or is there something unique about East Gloucester that we want to address?
John?
Yeah, I mean, short of taking parcel by parcel, I mean, what's over here seems to work. I mean, I live over here, obviously, and have been here my whole life. But even if we did anything with this, the permitting remains the same, Greg, am I correct? I mean, if they want to do something beyond what their use is now, I mean, right now it's zoned with grandfather, people that are there with residential are grandfathered, the marinas are grandfathered. I mean, what else could we, and this is a question probably to Greg, what else could you really do with this other than separating each individual parcel?
Well, I mean, I think from a certain standpoint, if there's, for instance, a property that's vacant, undersized but vacant, if someone were to come forward with an application to do 1 or 2 family or 3 family, whatever it might be, that they could demonstrate that they had the capacity for parking and those types of things, the zoning board would have to make a finding that there's really no other viable use for the property and grant a use variance for residential use in the area. And then also likely dimensional relief because of it being undersized. But that's the burden for an applicant to expand a use or introduce a residential use, particularly in, could be a lot between 2 houses and it looks like it, a house could go there. That's kind of the burden, and the message of the zoning ordinance is residential use isn't allowed. So, there's the potential opportunity to try to define a district. Again, what was suggested at the time was neighborhood districts, because as you know, there's some small business mixed in with the residential uses along East Main Street, and that would encompass, both those possibilities. But it would be saying, these residential properties are okay. Again, though, from a permitting path perspective, even if you were to, have it at a 5,000 or a 10,000 square foot, all of the lots are undersized. So they would still have to go to the zoning board of appeals for any type of relief. I think one of the points of the discussion, which, Matt kind of alluded to, is, if you defined what's marine industrial now, the larger parcels that have marine related uses, marinas, that type of thing, kind of put them into their own box. Then when you consider changes for the marine industrial district, that's really coincident with the designated port area. As you make changes, you don't have to think about what the impact would be to these other areas that are outside of the district. We have a notation right now for the entire MI district that talks about its compliance with the DPA. for the properties in East Gloucester that were removed, it's not applicable. They have to comply with the Chapter 91 regulations, but not the DPA regulations. So just things like that. If there were a particular use, a new use under consideration that seemed like it might be really appropriate for the designated port area, but maybe not in East Gloucester, we don't have an ability right now to distinguish between the two.
Katie?
I was just stepping back for a minute and wondering if it's kind of difficult to talk about this because we're talking about one specific area and the challenges that are associated with it of making change have just been gone over. But then stepping back out and like we were talking about a moment ago and looking at the whole harbor, the breadth of the coastal area, even though this isn't in the DPA, and what does the data say is what's the potential for the future of Gloucester and for the jobs and for the heritage and all of the qualities of the harbor that we want to protect and advance for our fishing industry and everything associated that we've discussed. Then once we have that information, if that came back to us through Matt's team and talked about these are the assets and this is the potential, that then would help us think about this area that we're talking about now in East Gloucester with a little bit of a more universal lens. Do you think that's true? Is that why it's hard to have this discussion, is because we're thinking about it as one area instead of part of the whole?
Question for Matt or?
Matt, sure.
We don't, typically we just organize a plan by sub areas sometimes because it allows us to speak about the different characteristics of different portions of the plan. If the goals for the rest of the harbor seem to sort of universally reapply in East Gloucester, that's fine. It was just, here's an area that was removed from the DPA. It's got a unique set of, it's the only area in the plan that isn't, most of it that isn't restricted by the DPA. So we just feel like we have to ask, which is having been unshackled from those requirements, are we doing all that we think is possible here? And in terms of the, what's economically possible, we can bring back all the economic analysis that we did. I think we're going to find that it's highly contingent on building capacity and other things. I don't think there's some sort of precise number or some precise industry that we're going to sort of target and locate here. But if we want to frame it in those terms, we can do that. I think it's going to apply more generally to the overall harbor, right?
Right.
But I don't think it's a limiting lens. And I should remind everyone that the economic analysis and the recommendations that we made, a lot of that goes off into a different implementation area, right? What we've been trying to do now is pivot a little bit more towards actually creating the municipal harbor plan, which is the document that spells out what the objectives are. It doesn't necessarily spell out how all the economic initiatives are implemented and by whom. And a lot of those items don't relate to the regulatory framework of the waterfront, right? The harbor plan it's a land use, basically a land use regulatory document. And our focus now is on making sure it can do everything it possibly can in the service of those other goals that we've identified, and within the framework of the economic development that we've explored, and the assessment of the infrastructure and all that. So I didn't want to create confusion by putting a circle around East Gloucester and indicating it was more important or less important than anything else. It occupies a special place in our regulatory framework, and so I thought it was worth allowing the committee to be more addressed more consciously what really we think we want to do here that's different or special, if anything.
I think it's important to remember when that boundary review was requested, that there was no agenda, right? And I don't know that we, even just the simple request, I don't know that you're allowed to give any sort of guidance in the request. And so, and it's simply a, it's a sniff test, right? And so the reviewers came out, they did their thing. 6 months later, this parcel came out, and it wasn't from the city's perspective, oh, we think this should come out because we want to do X, Y, and Z. It was an application, it was an exercise to go through that we had never been through since the DPA had been adopted, and certainly with no agenda behind it, because there's no telling what would stay in and what would come out, if anything. And then poof, East Gloucester comes out. Okay, so what does that mean? So it means that it didn't probably belong in the DPA from the very beginning, in my opinion. And so again, there's no agenda, there's no plan, there was no, if we get out, this is what we're going to do, right? And it's dense. I mean, so all the reasons why there's really nothing to do there, unless you buy up every piece of parcel, piece of land, tear everything down, and then start from anew. That's not going to happen, right? I mean, so I mean that's the origin of it, right? I mean, there was no agenda, and it was frankly a surprise, right, as a chair of that committee. So, I don't know what we can do different.
I think it's a good point that it's settled very densely, and the settlement and the development is very mature. And I think your assessment's right. It's very unlikely that an enormous swath of East Gloucester is going to be bought up and consolidated and assembled, and there'll be some opportunity for something else.
Okay, so the next step here.
It may be that there aren't specific new actionable ideas for East Gloucester moving forward. I mean, there's been some successes. It's been the area of growth for Cape Ann Lobsterman, for instance. It continues to support waterfront access in a variety of forms. Maybe the goal for East Gloucester is to keep on and to preserve some of that character, and to preserve some of the mix of uses that make it what it is.
I think that's an acceptable, right? I mean, we can't wave a magic wand and do different, right? I mean, and really the only investment, with the exception of Tesla's business, is the Clam Shack, and that's moving in a direction that's going back to its roots. And John, you probably know when Jane Amaro was there lighting on people's hair on fire, but how long ago was that?
Bob Kersey before him. Bob's
Right.
Clam Shack.
Right. So
A little bit more than hair.
yeah. So anyways, I think if we have to address East Gloucester, I think that's the answer, right? It's dense. It's come out. It probably didn't belong in the first place, which might lead you to a questioning of, what other things in the DPA don't belong. Greg and I don't know how long ago this was, Greg, that we went to a city council meeting in Beverly, and the then mayor, walked into the place and says, "We're getting rid of the DPA in Beverly." And everybody's like, "Well, okay." 15 minutes later, there's unanimous vote. This is what we're going to do, and this is why we're going to do it, and it was removed, right? I mean, so not that we're starting that discussion here, but it's it happens. So we have a next slide, Matt, or are we at our?
Yeah, I
minutes.
think that the last agenda item here is talk just a little bit about I think the next slide is about the public meeting.
Right.
And we're not writing the final plan between now and then. It's really about summarizing where the planning priorities are going to be and how that is manifest in some of the approaches that we have to some of the regulatory items in the plan. So the overall vision and the goals, supporting uses, local zoning, if relevant, sub-area issues, for instance, issues that are specific to Harbor Cove, for instance, or the publicly owned parcels, and then other municipal harbor planning considerations and next steps.
So Tony, I'd like to give 25 minutes for you to rant on your frustration of the things that you weren't seeing. And, I think Matt sort of talked about, or at least addressed that issue on, the
Nice, Rick.
economic
That was
analysis.
nice of you, Rick. Thanks.
Well, but I know that you know.
Enough, Rick, enough.
I do feel like it's been a long time since Kevin made his presentations about what the opportunities were. That's what, the hope of this is, that there are opportunities that are somehow not set up for or realized in what we do in the harbor area. And that's what the plan is there to do, is to try to make some adjustments to capitalize on those potential opportunities. So that seems like it needs a little bit of a revisit in order to prepare for this. I think, I mentioned to Matt a couple of days ago, again, I think Kevin made his presentations before, we're seeing what's happening in Salem. So to the extent that that's, going to be realized, that there's going to be more activity for some of the uses that exist on the harbor, and understanding what that might look like, that might be something worth revisiting as well. It's just transpired into, thinking about this public property, of whether, that's going to create an opportunity for a business that might want to locate, to be prepared for supporting that activity in Salem, which we've definitely heard that. I've heard it in presentations of how it will spill over to other nearby harbors, in particular Gloucester, because has the marine railway, has boat repair for commercial vessels here. So that might be something that makes sense to revisit as well. But it's been a long go. This is, and doing it all this way, maybe sometimes it doesn't have the same impression if we were sitting around a table. So I think we need to spend some time, Matt, on kind of framing that back up, maybe re-summarizing where we've been in order to prep for this meeting.
Yep. I think that would be an important part of the public meeting even. Yes. Is repositioning that. And I think some degree of the economic analysis was shared with the public, but revisiting that and contextualizing that effort within the municipal harbor plan.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, Greg, are you really consider that there's any repurposing for the wind technology on either of these two parcels?
No, I think what I've heard
I think
is
that's sort of what the message I think you just sent. So I think we need to be really careful about that.
no. I want to be perfectly clear. And there's been assessments prepared by Mass CEC when they were looking at this for the deployment of some of the larger wind projects. What's been suggested publicly, at least, and also by the proponents of some of the projects, is there's going to be a lot more vessel activity in this area. That's something that there are industries here that are servicing commercial vessels, and so they should anticipate that there's going to be a need. But it would be great to hear firsthand what, what kind of traffic we're expecting, and, what kind of need there's going to be, and anything else that might be related to, that taking off as Salem being the marshaling site for those wind projects. So not local Gulf wind projects, but what's in the pipeline to be marshaled out of Salem.
Tessa?
Thanks.
I said one quick thing that I think if you talk to like the railways or Roses or any of those marinas currently, they're so backed up that they can't even haul out boats that are here. And a lot of lobster boats go to Maine and get stuff done because there's not enough services here. So to me, adding more boats into the mix is just gonna cause another problem that we sort of already have. So I don't know if you've talked to any of them at Roses, or I just know that like even Cape Ann Marina is starting to do more commercial boats just because the two marinas can't fit everyone in as it is. So that might just be something we want to look at.
Thank you, Tessa. That's an unusual problem to have. And do we have an idea of our next harbor planning meeting date? Is it, I mean, certainly the public agenda, public meeting agenda.
I guess if we're backing out from that date, which is going to come around really quickly, I'm thinking we probably need another meeting in advance of that. And if people are comfortable with Thursdays, it could be the 21st
Of July.
of July.
Yep.
Does that seem like it makes sense for you, Tiskina, Matt?
Yeah, that I think that's fine.
Greg, are we pushing out the public meeting date?
I mean, that's a question of whether you think we can be prepared by that point. It'll be coming around pretty quickly.
Mhm.
And I guess I leave it also to the committee, if you want more time to be prepared for that as well.
So man, I guess, Vito, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, I don't think I'll be available that day. What time of day would we be having the public hearing?
I mean, we've usually been doing like a 5 or a 6 o'clock start.
Mhm. Yeah, I know I'll be in Boston. Catherine Glenn has something going on that some national working waterfront thing that she asked me to be a part of, so I'm not sure when we'll be back from Boston. It's a public meeting, so don't need me. Just letting you know, I might not be available.
So that's on the 21st, Vito, right? That's,
Right, yep.
Yeah.
And I believe that's what Greg was just talking about, is possibly the 21st, right?
yeah, it was the difference between this group versus the public meeting. I was just,
Right.
yeah.
And that you would be at that commitment as well, Katie, correct?
My commitment is on the 19th, which is what I emailed you about, Greg.
Yep.
But the conference is that whole week, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I may be there as well. I know I've registered.
Very relevant conference for this group, the National Working Waterfront Conference.
Does it make sense to utilize the 27th for the committee and move the public meeting out?
That sounds like a better idea, Greg.
Okay. Let me just actually, if we're going to stick with Thursdays, it would be the 28th. Does 28th at 2 work for folks for a committee meeting on the 28th?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Yeah.
And if we were to look towards either the 3rd or the 17th for a public meeting, what are folks' commitments like for August 3rd or 17th?
Well, I'm traveling on the 3rd.
Okay.
I'm on vacation 3rd. The
Okay.
17th looks okay.
17th looks good. Why don't we tentatively hold August 17th?
Greg, I don't know if you have to be at it, but there's a P and D meeting that night.
I don't know that what will be on the agenda, but
Don't have a crystal ball.
don't have a crystal ball, but I think it's more important for, the committee and Matt and Taskina to be there as well. But I'll try to make sure that I'll be free. Can always write memos.
Okay. That wrap us up for today.
There has been a hand up in attendees if you want to take any public comment at this point. If not, then we can have a motion for adjournment.
So Suzanne's been waiting all meeting, so let's recognize her for 5 minutes and then we'll.
Okay.
Suzanne, just need to unmute yourself and just state your
Okay,
name
I'm
and
here.
address for the record.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Good. Susanna Altenburger, 66 Atlantic Street, Philbolton, France. We've been a zoning board since 52, so it's 70 years. I hope you've all received this report, the interim report on your harbor plan proceedings. You should have received it. I shared it with the city, first the mayor, then the city council, then city planner, and of course you folks should have gotten this as well. It's a 22,500 word document, 66 pages, well illustrated. It's an easy read discussing what might be problems in your approach so far. Because much of what you're straining with, and these are legitimate strains, is the absence of enough marine industrial activity in this port, courtesy of what we noticed 20 years ago, June of 2002, time runs, that under CFR 651, I mentioned this before, we have federal rules that simply froze the industry, the fishing industry in time as of the early 1990s. These rules are from March 1st, 1994. First committee meeting started in 92, 93. So we're looking at a good around 30 years of federally dictated stagnation in the fleet structure, in the development of boat shapes, propulsion systems, and therefore also catch technology. And when you're stagnating for a full human generation of close to about 30 years now, all sorts of things come up that you would never expect. This meeting, the idea of a harbor plan would have been mysterious 60, 70, 80 years ago because this harbor took care of its own economic future. Harbor properties would change hands, business would come and go, certain ideas would pan out, others would disintegrate, some folks would hang on forever and others barely making it the first year. This would be the normal marketplace of ideas, ingenuities, entrepreneurial spirits, and catastrophic failures. It's just part of the deal. So the idea that we will be discussing how come this is all so difficult, and do we need to relieve ourselves from the DPA, for instance? Well, the DPA is necessary, like so many other regulations, because things would have gone off the rails without those supervision, the state interest in the working waterfront. A long time ago, we would have the whole place covered in vinyl-clad condos, and everybody looking at the same wave, thinking this is a terribly brilliant economic development model. And of course, it is not. You can only sell these properties once. You can jack up the property prices over time, but there's a limit to that rainbow. In the meantime, marine industrial pursuits, if you had an industry that was viable without CFR 651, or rather CFR 651 very much adjusted, they tried it one cycle in 2014, did the wrong end of the thing, you would not have to worry about whether I4C2 is in a good place. But since you keep curating I4C2 conversations, again, today, you did not show this project here on the public record since December 15, 2010 at City Hall. It was presented in, like everybody else's, the I4C2 vote. If you don't train the next generation, if you don't make marine industrial work interesting, if you don't show a future, what do you expect will happen to the properties in this harbor? Today, I've talked with somebody you all know about the future of Gloucester Harbor. We're planning things without you folks, by the way. Maybe this is actually going to go somewhere. I've been to many machine shops and boat yards where people simply are complaining, I don't have young folks to take the reins here. I'm going to retire. And it is only possible because we've got this atmosphere of melancholy, of depression. I see it in the committee hearings here. We need to relieve ourselves of evil regulation. No. You need to relieve yourself of the correct evil regulation, CFR 651, and you can all read up on this. Again, the report you should have all received. I hope that wasn't curated into oblivion. Everybody in this town will read this. Some folks are putting it on the website. We're going to have a robust conversation, and from here we'll spread across Massachusetts. Other port economies are affected by this as well. They're going to be looking at their harbor plans. How come there's no word in those harbor plans about CFR 651? If you choke the fishing industry fleet structure to death, ugly things will happen. So on I4C2, I keep hearing there was no second step taken. The proposal from us was one of the only out of 22 proposals, if not 23, that actually had a forward-looking perspective. Bring the next generation in there, train them in all the marine industrial, marine scientific trades you need to have in order to have a viable port economy. And that changes the atmosphere completely because you've got young folks interested. These are good paying jobs. These are portable skill sets. And the public will come and watch these young folks work and build things from scratch, including spectacular public launchings, some in midday, some in the midnight hour. The idea that we should not be seeing to our future. Instead, we're discussing whether I4C2 should be a parking lot or maybe another summer full of inflatable movie screen public viewings. Is just beyond embarrassing. I think 2 or 3 generations ago, people would have thought this is complete folly. This is just nutty. And folks with a heavier accent than mine would be saying that as well. So I would propose to you to take this report very seriously and particularly study I4C2, because that project has been on the public record for now almost 12 years. The idea that this property lies fallow, taking money away from the Gloucester Police Department, from the Gloucester Fire Department, from the Gloucester school system, that is the doing of a few folks who are usually not elected. And I don't think this committee wants to be part of that level of inaptitude for 12 years of not leveraging. We could have done so many things by now. 12 years of losses. It's unarguable. It's not my opinion. And so I don't think this Harbor Planning Committee wants to be known on the record, including with this publicly viewable video of today, that you folks never understood I4C2. The project for VOC has been there forever. You open up school funding from the state, federal funding, it will be part of a city. So a city-owned property with a city-owned school facility drawing on state and federal funding does not need any private input. Does not need, we can only offer the project, but you do not need private funding. The idea we need to attract investors for the property. I don't need to get an invested property for City Hall. City Hall runs itself. Once you are fully understanding this is part of the city's working waterfront, the only property we have in Gloucester in which a city can show a commitment to the 21st century ocean-centric future for our many, hopefully another 400 years of generations. Unless you do that, all of this is just an unfortunate looking show that most folks will shake their heads over. And I'm not
Suzanne,
sure
I'd like your 7 minutes into your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you. Okay. I will accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
We don't know your roll call vote.
Roll call. Member Noonan,
Yes.
Member Bal,
Here.
Member Call,
Here.
Member Brown, Member Brown,
Oh, sorry, here.
Member Gigaloni,
Yes.
Member Gross,
Yes.
Member McCarthy.
Yes.
Okay,
All right.
we'll
Thank
see you soon.
Bye-bye.
All right.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.